Hi everyone, it's Dr. Antonelli, and we're back for part two of this video lecture on rights and responsibilities of teachers, students, and parents. Part one, we focused on the legal responsibilities that you will have as a teacher and then your legal rights that you will have as a teacher. And we're now going to focus on the last two pieces, legal rights of students and then legal rights and responsibilities of parents. So let's go back to your legal rights of students slide. There's a couple of things going on here. If you recall, we talked about schools really acting in place of parents, known as in loco parentis, and students themselves have some legal rights. Let's start with freedom of expression. Expression has to do with things like writing, speaking, the dress codes that students are held to, things like censorship. And the key with freedom of expression is that students have a legal right to express themselves in a variety of ways, whether it's in something they write or how they speak or what they say or what they wear. However, what comes into play here is that it cannot just be wide open. And the key is to remember, if a student wears a shirt, let's say, that has something on it that is what we call unsuitable for immature audiences, then a school can ban students from wearing that particular shirt that has whatever is written or picture on it or something that might disrupt the educational process and really not be suitable for a school setting. So that's how these legal right issues kind of get settled, is that they always look at how it's impacting the rest of the school environment, even though students do have a legal right to express themselves in a variety of ways. The second legal right students have is to due process. You want to write down the 14th Amendment next to due process, because we discussed the 14th Amendment, which has to do with not denying someone life, liberty, or property. Due process rights come into play when there are issues related to, let's say, discipline that schools impose on students or suspension and expulsion. When it comes to discipline, this issue is related to corporal punishment in schools. There are a number of states, more than half, that actually still allow corporal punishment, which is kind of physical use of physical force to subdue a student or discipline a student. I know you're probably surprised that more than half the states still allow that. By law, this is. However, keep in mind that most teachers are a little bit cautious and reserved in using um, corporal punishment with students. Most of the states that are in this group of states that allow corporal punishment are in the South or in the West. So just so that you're aware of geographically where those states are. But due process refers to if a student, let's say, is suspended for an infraction of a school rule, and their procedure is not followed according to school policy, then a student could say my due process rights were violated, and then it would have to go further in with other avenues to take to allow for due process rights. Okay. Another legal right of students is the right to privacy. You might want to write down here Fourth Amendment. This is the Fourth Amendment, which has to do with security and privacy at school. Students have a right to their private belongings. Issues related to this particular right has to do with when schools do search and seizure of student items. The key word here is it has to be reasonable, and there has to be a suspicion of something, normally known as contraband. This could be drugs, this could be weapons. The right to privacy has changed tremendously in recent years due to many of the violent acts occurring in schools, because we need to keep students safe. So a lot of times, even though students have a legal right to privacy, if there is any sort of reasonable suspicion of some sort of contraband that a student has brought to school, then oftentimes their legal right to privacy doesn't, come into play as much, because we're trying to keep all the students in a school safe. A couple of other issues under right to privacy related to crime and violence have to do with the Gun-Free School Zones Act, which is an act that says there are no guns allowed within 1,000 feet of a school, and usually students are or could be expelled for a year if they're found carrying a gun. However, the Supreme Court, when we talked about court cases, remember, the Supreme Court actually struck down that law as being unconstitutional. So again, these are issues that are often worked out in courts as well, even though they're a legal right of students. In addition, students have a right to their student records. Parents have a right to the see students' records that schools keep if they're under 18, and then students have a right to see the records if they're over 18 without parental consent. Another legal right for students is the right to non-discrimination. So if you recall back in the teacher slide, let me flip back one for you, we talked about this same thing for teachers, that you as a teacher have a legal right to not be discriminated against for any reason. And we listed some of those. This is the same for students. Students have the right to not be discriminated against based on their gender, based on if they speak English or another language, or if they participate in bilingual ed programs. They shouldn't be discriminated against based on that. They have a right not to be discriminated against if they require special services because they are categorized as having a disability under the categories of disabilities. And a good example of disabilities is the AIDS epidemic. That disease is considered a physical impairment under the categories of special education. So students who have AIDS have a right to not be discriminated against. So that's one of their legal rights. And then finally on this slide is legal issues after September 11th. When we talk about September 11th, 9/11, for those of you that don't know the short way of what we refer to when we say 9/11. After 9/11, so many issues came up about students being able to carry cell phones so that parents could reach them in the case of an emergency or a lockdown. And then there were issues about reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, whether a student can be forced to do that or not, because there was a wave of patriotism after September 11th. In addition, there was legal issues related to can the military recruit, or should the military be able to recruit students in public schools to serve in the military for purposes of we need more soldiers for wars. So again, a lot of those legal issues came into play after 9/11. Okay, and now for parents, some of this slide has to do with the legal rights that parents have, but then also parents are legally responsible for certain things. So the first one you might want to put next to parental information and consent, you might want to put the word right, because that is a right of a parent. A parent has the legal right to know if their child is progressing in school. They have the legal right to consent to a field trip or participation in an activity. They have a right to know if their child is being subject to any discipline procedures. They have a right to be part of the IEP process if their child has a disability that requires an IEP. And let's say the parent does not speak English, then that meeting and everything related to the IEP must be translated into the parent's language. They have a legal right to that as well. So just be aware of all the things involved under the first one. Under the second one, you need to kind of put both the word right and responsibility. Compulsory school attendance means that, let's start with the responsibility piece. Parents have a legal responsibility to feed their children, clothe their children, and have control over their child's education. That's something that they are responsible for. And so that's why it's a responsibility. But it's also a legal right when it comes to controlling the child's education, because they have a right to choose where to send their child. They don't have to send them to a public school if they choose to send them to a private school or a religious school or a Christian school or some other school. They have that legal right to do that, okay? So just kind of keep that in mind. And they also have a legal responsibility to make sure children attend school and to get the proper immunizations that are needed. That is the legal responsibility as well of parents when it comes to school attendance, okay? However, on the flip side, they also have the legal right to choose not to send their children to school, to either homeschool, which we'll talk about in the next one, or let's say to do something else. And a good example of a group that gives this exception to compulsory school attendance is the Amish. The Amish group chooses to often not send their children to public schools, and that's their legal right to do that. Okay, and the last piece that I just kind of was leading into was that parents have a legal right, so you might want to put right next to this one, to homeschool their children. This is a legal right for many reasons, and parents are choosing it for many reasons. It's been on the rise, the idea of homeschooling, since around 1990, and it has to do a lot with sometimes the religious beliefs of families and wanting them to um, homeschool their children with other families who have the same religious beliefs, and they work together. They also, other reasons parents homeschool: fear of violence in the schools, disagreement over the curriculum and what's taught in schools. There are a ton of issues that parents have for their reasons for homeschooling. However, it is still their legal right to choose to do that. I do want to note that there are many variations in the homeschooling sector that go from state to state. Some schools are very strict and rigorous. Other schools are not. Other states are not when it comes to their rules. Some states you have to be a certified teacher in order to homeschool your child. Other states you do not. Some states the children are required to take the testing. Other states they do not. Some states require students who are being homeschooled, the parents are supposed to report the curriculum and what they're doing to the state. Other states, they do not have those kind of restrictions. So there is a wide variation. So there's a good website, www.hslda.org. And if you go on that website, it gives you a great map of the United States. And it has it color coded as to which states follow which set of rules and restrictions for homeschooling. Okay, so just be aware of that. It's a great kind of map to look at. So we've now talked about legal rights and responsibilities of teachers, legal rights of students, and legal rights and responsibilities of parents. The rest of this PowerPoint had to do with some discussion topics that we would have done in a class setting. So just kind of take a look at them and think about, what you would feel the answer might be here, or your viewpoint on this related to things we talked about. There's 4 there. And then start thinking about your reflection for the next due date, which is, I believe, next Tuesday, and that will be on homeschooling. So I'll put that in the announcements for you. Okay, I hope everyone has a great day. Enjoy.